Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Seibert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
Well, welcome to Relationships Inside Out, where today we're going to talk about fear and some tips to overcome fear, depending on how it's playing a role in our life.
Fear can look different for everybody, as is true for any of these topics, right? But for some people, it can be every once in a blue moon. For other people, it can be our daily state of living.
It can be very consuming. And that's really where it comes down for me is fear is a normal emotion. We need to have fear. It's evolutionary.
Keeps us alive.
Keeps us alive. Yeah. I don't want to think that those 10 lions out in the field are one of them could be cuddly. Like I need to be afraid. I need to be afraid.
Yeah.
But it comes down to how much does that fear impair your ability to function? And that's really the concern for me. So for example, I have clients who have been through severe car accidents and they're afraid to drive again. Well, that impairs ability to function, go to work, get a job, run
socialize,
errands, pick up their kids from school.
Yeah.
Like that's impairing. So that's where we need to intervene.
Even agoraphobia, fear of crowds, right?
Yeah.
So fear of being around a lot of people. And this one we actually saw go up quite a bit with COVID because we got used to being in our four walls by ourselves.
Like that video, that little kid's like, uh-oh, people.
I haven't seen this.
Yeah. So I wish I don't know if there's a term.
TikTok
but
or YouTube?
Probably all of it at this point. But at this point, or for me, it's like, oh my God, I'm afraid of people. I just want to be around people. I wonder if there's a term for that.
People in general.
Just people.
No people. Yeah, fear can dominate our space. Sometimes it just sits in the back of our head. Think like, okay, we're getting on a roller coaster and that kind of excitement fear. And then it can
That's not excitement fear for me. I don't want to go.
You don't like roller coasters?
I don't.
Oh my gosh. I would live on one if I could,
yeah.
Which is strange as an HSP.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Highly sensitive person's HSP.
Yes. Neurodivergence. Typically people who are HSPs don't like roller coasters. That's another topic for another day.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I don't deny that.
Unless they're high sensation seeking, which would be me. My daughter, I don't think she'll ever ride a roller coaster ever in her life. But it can be that where it's this kind of excitement fear, or if we're going to like a new place, that kind of fear. But for other people, it can be all consuming, crippling. It can tear our body apart to where we go into paralysis or flight or even fight. But it prevents us from doing certain things, even normal functioning type of things like going to a grocery store.
And when we talk about fear, I mean, conceptually, I think all of us are like, ooh, spiders or heights or roller coasters. But this also includes fear of getting close and intimate with somebody, or fear of being vulnerable, fear of being left in a relationship, fear of being imperfect, or fear of being criticized.
Or being seen.
Yeah.
What if they discover who I really am? Then what?
Yeah. If they don't like themselves, they're afraid of other people, right? Perceptually. But I mean, I think about going back to like the fear of failing. Right. A lot of people have that fear. And so what are you not giving yourself the opportunity to do because you're afraid of failing?
Good point.
Then I think about all the successful, like they talk about people who are very successful in business. They failed multiple times and they just keep going. For others, they fail and it's done. And I've worked in short-term inpatient psychiatry, as you know, both of us at Tallahassee Memorial Hospital, and we work with some clients who are homeless. And that was a big thing that a theme that came up that I was surprised about is if I'm here and at the bottom, I don't have to be afraid of failing.
There's nothing to risk.
Nothing to risk for some. That's not all of them, but that was a theme that I found. So
fear is, to me, an assessment of risk, right? How big is the risk if I do this thing? If I go swim with sharks outside of a cage, the risk might be pretty bad, right? Pretty
and there's people who don't care about that. They do it.
Oh, I want to go swimming with sharks.
In
a cage. And actually, I think when we go to Jamaica this year, I might go swim with sharks.
Shark Week's coming up.
But they're sand sharks, so it's fine.
Yeah.
But it's our assessment of risk, right? Is this something that like might make me uncomfortable, might make me a little nervous, or is it something that I could perceive as catastrophic risk? I could die.
Yeah.
I could be trapped. Something of the sort. And intimacy can pull both of those out.
Absolutely.
If I am fully vulnerable and I come from maybe a household where that was frowned upon and even led to abuse, there is risk then if I'm vulnerable with another human that abuse will repeat. So therefore, I'm not going to take that risk.
Yeah. And there's a lot of subjectivity to the perceived
100%.
risk. And I go back to that shark example. There's people who are swimming with the great whites, are like,
You're not going to swim with the sharks, are you?
I'm not, no.
Oh, you're so lame.
I have my scuba diving license, and I actually unintentionally did swim with some tiger sharks down way below. So
fun.
Yeah, no.
But yes, it everyone's assessment might look different.
Assessment, yeah. And there's some general fears, right? Like that people have of dying, and some don't, but in general, everyone's like, yeah, that's a scary thing. But then like the shark thing, there's variability in that. Going to the grocery store, there's variability in that. Vulnerability and being vulnerable, there's variability in that.
Having children. All of these can elicit different types of fears. One thing I talk to clients about is, for me, like spiders are the equivalent of Satan. Like I cannot do spiders. And the thing about fear is our brain doesn't differentiate between fear of a spider versus fear of a bear, at least in my body. To my body, both are fear, both are threats to my safety, so both must die immediately. That's an important thing to remember, because when we're anxious, when we're fearful, reminding yourself, your brain doesn't know the difference. So when you say, oh, it's just a bug, to some people, it is just a bug. To other people's brains, it's not just a bug.
It's death.
So give yourself and the people around you a little bit of grace, because our assessment of fears varies by person, and the brain doesn't know the difference. If you perceive it as a threat is a threat. Yeah. There's not different categories of threats for the brain. Well,
and initially, right, you might have this automatic response where your autonomic nervous system, fight, flight, or freeze, gets triggered, and it's like danger, danger, danger. But then the prefrontal cortex part of our brain, where it's supposed to be rational and logic, can come in and be like, oh, you know what, that's okay. If this were to happen, worst case scenario, I have to go to the hospital with a spider bite, something to that extent, right? Like
I would eat my children.
But this is where I like working with clients, getting a sense of control over that, is the meaning you're making over it. We might have that initial response. I always give the example of, you're walking on a hiking trail, you kind of see a coiled up object, fight, flight, or freeze. And then you come in and reassess, and instead of responding and stuff, you're like, okay, hold on, is that a snake? And then you're like, oh, that's a coiled up rope. Like challenging that and asking yourself, like, if this were to happen, what's the worst gonna happen? If you were to be vulnerable and rejected, what's the worst case scenario?
If I were to be in connection with someone, what's the worst case scenario? The important part there that we're starting to talk about is that it doesn't have to stay the way it is. Unless it's spiders, then we're all just doomed. But if you are fearful, you can work through that fear. It doesn't have to remain a dominant force in your space. There are different techniques, types of therapy, things you can do at home that can help you move out of our reptilian brain, or that fight, flight, or freeze, and into our more rational prefrontal cortex.
Yeah. And even kind of going through that, a question that we just did, that we were talking about, in the sense of, well, what's the worst case scenario? Some people get stuck in that worst case scenario. And maybe that question's not helpful, but then the next question is, what's the probability of that worst case scenario happening? How many times in your life have you been in that scenario and you've been safe and fine and well?
What's hard is when someone's narrative actually does affirm that fear.
That's what we're challenging, right? That would be one way to challenge it, is what evidence do you have that will happen every time? I look at it as like mind reading, jumping to conclusions, fortune telling, predicting the future. And essentially, going back to the evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. It's safer for your brain to assume danger and threat and consume calories on that assessment. But living there is miserable. So how do we challenge that and try to put balance back in that perspective of, like, go back to the car accident example. Okay, you've been in a car accident. Maybe you've been in a couple. Okay, you've been driving for 30 years. So you're a female on average tend to drive like 10,000 miles per year. So 300,000 miles in your lifetime, you've been in a couple accidents. Like, when you think about it that way, what's the probability? And really just challenging that perspective. This is where we get control, and really trying to assess it objectively, and not running with this initial response of fight, flight, or freeze.
I recommend here finding a therapist who's skilled in this, because sometimes our ability to ask those rational questions when we're the one in the thick of it, even as therapists, when I'm in the thick of my fear, if I were to ask myself that, I could talk myself out of it 1,000 ways, right?
Not me. I'm good though, but go ahead.
But if we have someone who is an objective perspective,
Absolutely,
that can be really powerful, especially someone who's skilled in knowing what to ask, what to think about, even exposure. So exposure therapy, it can be a buzzy term, and it's not as simple as you come into therapy and we show you a spider. It is a gradual process.
Yeah.
And that is true with all types of fears, even vulnerability, right? Therapy gradually opens you up, or it can, to vulnerability, to taking that risk, also giving you strategies to keep yourself safe. So if it feels like too much, how do you protect your body?
Yeah.
So I recommend therapy here. And it was someone who's skilled in this.
If it's impairing your ability to function.
Absolutely.
Or if you're just like, this is uncomfortable, I just want to get rid of this one in my life. It doesn't serve any purpose. And I like the sense of the exposure, because really what the idea here is in a very, again, gradual process, not so much where you're flooded and it just scares you again. But the idea here is to expose you to that fear and let you sit with that fear and that emotion, and then help you systematically desensitize to it, either through skills or just the natural kind of exposure to it.
Which takes time. It's not immediate. It's not like you go one session and poof, you're not afraid of whatever it was before. It takes time. Yeah.
You're not getting thrown in the deep end of the pool on swimming lessons. You're starting out in the shallow end. You're gradually going, you're getting the feel for the water. Like, okay, I can do this. And you're not even going to the deep end right away. You're just standing there and sitting there or whatever on the steps to the shallow end, depending on where your comfort level is.
So what we don't want to do is flood the brain, or in that exposure, have something feel catastrophic or go catastrophic, and thus reaffirming that narrative. Yeah. So it has to be this gradual process of inviting the brain to kind of lessen that response.
And I like to put both the cognitive and the exposure together, in the sense of you're working on practicing adaptive thoughts and challenging these initial, fears where your brain's going to, like, worst case scenario is going to happen. Okay, what's the evidence of that? While also exposing and be like, you know what, I was in there, the shallow end, and I was fine. And really kind of both using the cognitive as a way to control, but also just the behavioral of exposing and getting a sense that you can be safe and that you do have some control in these situations.
And there are choices beyond full avoidance, right? There are ways that we can still be safe, whether it is having a supportive person or having ways to cope in that moment. But there are more options than full exposure or no exposure at all. Yeah.
And in the context of, like, say, relationships and fears in that, maybe some exposure, right? A little bit, but definitely the cognitive and in that sense, more like self-esteem potentially, and the meaning you're making if you're rejected. Like, what does it mean if you're rejected? And not even just flat out rejected, perceived rejection.
Truth.
And what I mean by that is, if your partner, say, is having a bad day, but they didn't communicate that and they're distancing, and now you perceive rejection, what does that mean to you? And, I think about the fear of rejection. Someone might just avoid and be like, I don't want to do this again. I'm not gonna be vulnerable. It's not safe enough to be vulnerable. And so the cognitive piece comes in here of, you know what, this may not be about me. What are they doing? Let me turn towards them and ask them what's going on. Or let me try again and be vulnerable, but maybe not so vulnerable it's like the deepest part of me, but maybe a little bit something less.
That's a little softer.
Yeah. While also telling myself that I am good enough, and rejection may not, even if I am rejected, it's not a product of me, and really challenging some of the thoughts of personalization in that process, while also continuing to practice. But if it's not met, of course, continually, then maybe that's a question of that's a good relationship or not.
That's the cycle piece, right? What fears or narratives or preconceived notions am I bringing in, and how is my partner affirming that or not affirming that?
And this plays a little bit on our last episode of attachment. So that will shape kind of that perspective. So challenging that perspective, and some of that could be exposure, and definitely some of the cognitive piece.
Do you have a partner that honors that fear, that respects that fear, that is gentle with that fear? Or do you have a partner who has no regard for it?
Yeah.
One obviously is much healthier than the other. But sometimes it's not just that our partner has no regard for it because they don't want to. Sometimes they don't know it exists. Sometimes they don't know that they're stepping on a landmine.
Yeah.
So talking about that fear of vulnerability or rejection or abandonment or whatever it might be, having those open dialogues, same was having open dialogues about fear of snakes. It's important to talk about it. The more we bring things into light, the less fear inducing ideally it would become.
Yeah. And nowhere in our conversation today have we said, find somebody else to help you with this fear in the sense of completely dependent upon someone else to resolve it.
Good point.
Right. This is something that we have to do ourselves, and it's not our partner's responsibility to manage that and support us through that, because say your relationship ends, then what?
Yep. Good point. That's that codependency.
Yeah.
Of I can't manage this fear without you.
Yeah.
That's not a healthy state to be in.
I mean, you're giving somebody a lot of power.
A lot of power.
And unfortunately, we're humans and we fail each other. So not everybody, even the people we love and are dear to us, I mean, they're going to mess up. And
with fear, I encourage talking about it like as parents with our kids early on, often even with like nightmares, right? Parents try to minimize that fear, or, oh, it's no big deal, just go back to bed. What that does is it sets us up for a narrative that we can't talk about fear. I encourage parents, people to do the opposite. Get curious. What was that nightmare like for you? What do you need? What emotions came up for you? Give comfort. Same with your partners. If they're experiencing fear, try not to taunt them or ignore it or minimize it. Try to get curious. Try to support when you can, and encourage them to find ways to support themselves. That's self-soothing.
Yeah, not running away from fear. It's an important emotion, especially from an evolutionary perspective of survival. And it doesn't have to be fear on specific things. It could just be a general fear of, what if things go wrong? Right? Just in like walking out the door, what if things go wrong? I have a bad day at work, or what if I get pulled over, or what if, I mean, you name it. Right?
There's zombies.
Zombies, yeah. I laugh at maybe somebody actually has that
they
fear,
do.
So,
they do. We all have these fears, whether they're rational or not, right? To my husband, the idea of fear of spiders, he's like, this is so stupid, Kim. They're smaller than your fingernail. And to me, I'm like, I can see that. And that's not how my body experiences it at all.
Okay, so that's what not to do.
What
as a
not
partner?
to do. Yeah.
As a partner.
Chris, hear that? He's our designated spider killer. There's a little bit of codependency there. But try not to minimize, even if in your brain you're like, this makes no sense at all. It might not, but in their brain it does.
Yeah, and they're responding to a physiological stimuli that's going on because of perceived.
That's an important part. It's not just cognitive. It's not just a thought.
Right.
We have a nervous system reaction when we're in fear.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. For some people, they have to pee. For some people, they get sweaty. Their heart starts to race. We have a full physiological reaction. It's not as simple as, well, just don't think about it. It is not that simple, people.
Yeah. And I also think about like a panic attack, right? There's a panic attack in cases of extreme fear, but then there's a panic disorder where you're afraid of having a panic attack. It's almost afraid of feeling that fear or of feeling that experience. I mean, it's more of just fear. I mean, we're talking heart racing, sweating, maybe
feels
nausea,
like a heart attack, fear of death,
numbness. Yep. Fear of losing control. I mean, there's a lot of
dissociating.
Yep.
Anxiety is a big part of the fear, right? Anxiety itself, to me, I think of it almost as like a best friend to fear. They can live together, right? If I'm anxious about something, okay, I'm starting to get worried. Ooh, I'm afraid to present in front of people. Oh, no.
Ooh, I hate presenting.
It's terrible. But they can live together, right? Or if I am anxious about my workday, I'm kind of nervous about my workday. What if I fail? What if I screw up? Oh my gosh, what if my boss comes to talk to me? Whatever it is, right? They live together.
Yeah.
And much like a Chinese finger trap, I tell my clients, try not to pull away and resist it. Lean into it. You're not going to get free from fear, from anxiety, from any of this by resisting and pulling away and pretending like it doesn't exist.
Or numbing with substances.
Truth. You have to lean into it and get to know it, which is uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable. But for the brain to really process it and to do something different with it, it has to get to know it. And accept that it's there.
And I think in doing so, along with asking yourself, how much has any fear that I've had in any context or in general fear kept me from living and experiencing and being present And to me, I think about that, and every so often I'll ask myself that and say, is there anything that I'm limiting myself on because of my anxiety?
Ooh, that's a good question.
I think about it, especially in the business world. I don't like presenting. So is there a fear?
Which, as your colleague, that's surprising, by the way.
Yeah. It's fake it till you make it. I'm pretty good at that. But in general, like from a physiological standpoint, I don't like it. I have a lot of performance anxiety in that sense. So how much is that? I think about it. How much has that limited me? Does that kept me from wanting to go back in academia or doing anything else? So it's just asking yourself, like, where does it play a role in your life, and is it limiting, and is it something I want to work on or not, or do you feel comfortable with where you're at? And I see this a lot in the business world. Is a fear of failure is limiting to a lot in terms of promotions. Well, they're going to expect more. I'm not going to live up to that need. I don't believe in myself. So maybe a self-esteem thing there. Or a fear of failing someone else's expectations of me. Oh, that one bothers me so much. Why are we giving so much other people power over?
And yet it's ingrained in our culture.
Yeah, it's so much. And that in itself is maybe a form of performance because you're performing for the other person. And I hear this a lot, especially like a childhood narrative. The parents put a lot of pressure to be perfect. And you may not think that it's related to the parents, but that narrative is still there of, oh yeah, if I don't perform or don't do X, Y, Z, then my parents will be upset or
disappointed.
I have to hold this image up that they've had of me for so long. And well, how has that limited you by holding on to that narrative?
And if it started in childhood, we may think of it as normal. Like everyone must feel this unsure of themselves, or this is a normal part of living. And it really doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
And it can be a lifelong journey. As a therapist, I've got so many tools in my noggin, and yet I struggle with my own anxieties and fears, like finances and spiders. It's hard. So even when we have all the tools, it's hard. But it doesn't have to stifle your lived experience. It doesn't have to dominate how you live your life.
Yeah.
You can move through it. But as I say that, I recognize that then there's fear about overcoming the fear, fear about facing it. I'll have clients who, in their first session or two, I'll say, how do you think about therapy? What do you think about it? And they'll say, I'm scared. I'm scared because I know this is going to hurt. I know this is going to be scary. I know that I'm going to be vulnerable. I know I might hurt my partner in this process. And so fear, we become afraid of being afraid.
Or the fear of uncertainty. And this is just my own, perspective, but I think about humans in general. We created science, we created all these things to help predict, because by predicting, we can remove uncertainty.
We soothe ourselves that way.
And to me, that is a means to reduce the fear of unknown, but it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective.
Right.
I rather predict the eating habits of a lion or what have you. That way I know to not be around at that time or to not do X, Y, Z, because then I can survive. Like uncertainty is very scary for us. And I think about all the things that humans in general have. So we're not alone. Nobody's alone in their fear or anxiety. This is a human experience that is very normal. It's what we do with it. And granted, people might experience it to a greater degree physiologically than others. And so now you're battling that. But a lot of self-soothing techniques, like we haven't talked about this yet, but mindfulness is a big one.
Big one. I
mean, it helps us, one, lean into it without judgment, which, you're talking about, Kim. And the other is slowing down your physiological response, where you get a lot through the breathing.
It's focusing on the here and now, not what could be, not what could have been, but the here and now.
Yeah. And that also kind of goes back to like, what are you missing out on? Well, but with the fear, but now being mindful, you're being present. So maybe you're able to be present and not miss out on the experience of being in a beautiful park in a beautiful day or whatever.
Playing with your kids, sitting with your partner.
I think some people want to miss that sometimes, depending if it turns into tantrums.
Rough. It's true though. And it looks so different for each person.
Yeah.
So find those coping skills, if it's mindfulness or CBT thought log, which we've talked about briefly before, of really breaking down our thoughts for what they are and what we want them to be. Really questioning the thought process we're having, getting curious about it. It can also be things like affirmations. So reminding myself I am worthy. I am good enough, even if I make a mistake.
Yeah.
My body's good enough. My spider killing abilities are good enough, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's again, not ignoring it, not pretending like it doesn't exist. That will make it bigger.
Mm-hmm.
It's acknowledging it. It's getting to know it. It's accepting that it's there. And then we can work with it.
Mm-hmm. And learn how to self-soothe to make it more tolerable.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Getting rid of it fully, I don't know if it's practical, but
maybe with some fears. But vulnerability, at the core, it's a scary thing.
Mm-hmm.
Connection, there's great risk. If I
Mm-hmm.
love somebody, if I connect with somebody, if I'm vulnerable and open and care about them, the risk is, what if they leave?
Mm-hmm.
What if they die?
And this is
Something happens.
And this is us using worst case scenarios to predict because it's uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to this fear of uncertainty. And
Mm-hmm.
what is our mind telling us? And rightly so, it's being like, well, these are the worst case scenarios to protect yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But they can't be the only thing that lives in there. There has to be other possible outcomes. Well, they could actually lean towards me and open up and everything turn out. That could be a possibility. Why can't we think about that? Well, some evidence in the past that they have rejected. Okay, well, was that personal or was it where they were at in their life? And
maybe it's giving that partner skills to be supportive. Maybe they don't know how to.
And what's interesting in the sense of, for myself, I always question like, why can't X, Y, this person be vulnerable? And then I realized that, and it sucks, but it's just the reality of things. If I'm vulnerable first, people are more likely to be vulnerable as well.
True.
But I had a fear of not being vulnerable first. And then that person probably experienced the same thing. And so you're both not being vulnerable and you really can't have an intimate connection. This is even friendships. Mm-hmm. But then when you were, it could open it up. Now there's friends who didn't respond that well. I'm like, okay, then that's not a person I want to be vulnerable with. And
that's okay too.
That's okay. Yeah.
You can choose how to use your vulnerability, your energy. Mm-hmm. There are certain people that it will be safer to engage in that fear than other people.
Yeah. And then it doesn't mean like I was vulnerable and they didn't vulnerable right back. It might take time. It might be different context. Maybe they have nothing to be vulnerable about in that moment. But yeah.
Such a complex one. Mm-hmm. Because fear, it is in our everyday life. It is why you don't go 80 down a neighborhood street. It is why you don't jump off the cliff. It is why we use spider spray every other week. It's 100% why.
Or get wasp catchers and yeah.
But again, it's about how much does it interrupt my daily living? Mm-hmm. And do I want it to change? Yeah. Is it in a place I'm ready for it to change? Tough one. Well, this has been Relationships Inside Out, where today we broke down fear. And fear is a normal part of living, but if it feels like too much, get support. Mm-hmm. Get the support you need so you don't have to feel that isolation or feel miserable anymore. As always, if anyone has any questions, thoughts, topic ideas, please feel free to email us at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com. And we look forward to chatting with you next time.
Thanks.